The way that I look at it now is the importance of constraints in engendering creativity. That if we feel like there's no limits, then I'll work until midnight and I'll probably do things that I actually don't need to be doing myself.
Warning: Damian Andrews' growing revenue and profit, if implemented, will put more money in your pocket. Please use with caution.
Welcome to Damian Andrews' Growing Revenue and Profit with international speaker and revenue and growth specialist, Damian Andrews. This is your source for practical, usable, and simple action steps that you can do every day to put more money in your pocket. And now, the host of Damian Andrews' Growing Revenue and Profit, Damian Andrews.
And the crowd cheers wildly to the trumpeting blast of elephants sliding through eyes of needles. This is Damian Andrews' Growing Revenue and Profit, the program that deals with all things that puts more cash in your pocket. It's the show that handles your revenue riddles, profit puzzles, operational oddities, and culture conundrums. I am the one, the only Damian Andrews, and on this show is the amazing and wonderful Jeremy Nagel. Now, Jeremy is a software startup business developer who created Smooth Messenger and then he sold it. Now, Jeremy has created a second software business, Focus Bear, a habit stacking and productivity app for people with ADHD or ASD which helps them build healthy habits in the morning, crush it at work, and then shut off in the evening. Now, he's managed to do all this successfully by balancing being a neurodivergent person, creating a successful business, and balancing his family life. Jeremy, impressive. Welcome to the show.
Thanks, really good to be on. And I think the balance is something that I've grown into recently. It wasn't particularly balanced in the early days of Smooth Messenger.
I'm pretty sure.
A year and a half ago.
Yeah, I would imagine that it's not. I know from my experience, and I'm sure for pretty much everyone listening, that balance is something that's this elusive idea that you actually strive to attain but don't actually get there. From your perspective, it sounds like now with Focus Bear, you've actually got a nice, and looking into your background, you've got a nice flow to things with the way you've developed this. Was it more difficult to do it the second time around or harder the first time around?
Probably harder the first time around because I didn't know what was coming and I didn't really know what I was doing. And now I have a bit of a template to follow. I guess in terms of balance as well, the way that I look at it now is the importance of constraints in engendering creativity. That if we feel like there's no limits, then I'll work until midnight and I'll probably do things that I actually don't need to be doing myself. Whereas now I've got some very clear boundaries that I cut off work at 5 p.m. and I cook dinner for my wife and I do other things around the house. And that's actually really helpful because it means I can plan my days around that, knowing that I'm not going to be able to work after 5 p.m. So I need to put systems and people in place who can do the work that I otherwise would have done in the past.
I love that. What you're talking about there, if you know, the task expands to the time allowed, and if you don't allow any time, or in the sense of no end time, it'll just keep going on and on. And I can relate to that, where I've worked till 2, 3 in the morning on something that probably didn't need to be there. A little bit of perfectionism kicks in. How did you manage that as well? Because there's in that ADHD, and I've never been tested, but I'm pretty sure I fit the mold very, very well. Can be very. I facetiously put it down to me being a Leo rat. If you're into horoscopes, I go, oh, shiny thing, I'm over there. Oh, shiny thing, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, that's fire, get out of there. Is it balancing that out? How did you find a way to actually do that? I mean, was it that stress of the first project that you did that you went, hey, I need to do something different here, and approached it that way?
Yeah, it really was born out of that crucible of selling the last business and feeling so stressed during that time, because at that time in late 2021, I had a day job. I was running Smooth Messenger, which had its own challenges in the sense that the majority of the customers were in North America, which
Mhm.
meant that I needed to wake up very early in order to provide customer support. And then I was also dealing with lawyers and accountants and negotiating with the acquirer. So I was feeling squeezed at all ends. And I was noticing that my ability to concentrate was actually going out of the window as I lost the the habits that I had around sleep and exercise. I was actually becoming less effective. So even though I was working more, I was achieving less. And I had this real sense that something is wrong here and I needed to change. But it felt like there wasn't really any other option at the time, just because I hadn't really put the systems in place at that point. And it felt like I just needed to push really hard for that time. And maybe that's true. I think there are times where there are just going to be exceptional circumstances that come up. But it's something that I've now tried to cultivate now with the new business, that I do need to have constraints, and I can have a team to support me during that time. And I can also be brave as well, because I think a lot of it is just anxiety and fear around, but what if an important email comes in at 6 p.m. and I'm not there to answer it? And now what I've told my team is, if that happens, call me. And if they don't call me, then I'm going to assume that everything's fine and that I'll be able to deal with it in the morning.
I love that. FOMO is such a massive thing, isn't it? Where we have this, where we need to have all this thing where just in case we miss out on this one thing that could actually do it. And it's like that one number in lotto that you're going, oh, maybe if I got that, it feels like that. And I know
Mm.
from my perspective, I did that a long time ago. My phone, my emails, everything for about 8 years now has lived on silent. I don't know if my phone rings unless I'm looking at it and it shows. But other than that, I don't know. And it's amazing how much I haven't missed out on anything. It's one of those things we feel that. When you were doing that as a business owner, because you've worked as an employee as well and as a business owner, how important is it to set that structure, and how difficult is it to set that structure? Because as an employee, you're kind of given a task to do and you get it done. And if you're really clever, you get it done really quickly, and then you walk around pretending that you're really busy. But as a boss of your own business, how do you actually give yourself the discipline or the structure to put those systems in place so that you actually do what you're doing now?
I have found it very challenging, especially because in my day job at the time as well, I was on call. I'm
Mm.
a software developer, and at times servers melt down at inconvenient times. And I also found that in my business, the same thing was happening. So I was almost conditioning myself to expect a disaster. And there were times where legitimately my team couldn't handle it, and I needed to wake up at 3 a.m. and sort out an issue with the server database indexes having been deleted and having to jump in and fight that fire. And it really messed with me, because then I'd go to sleep, but part of me is not actually sleeping. There's part of me that's still vigilant, expecting that something is going to happen and the phone
Mhm.
is going to ring. And it's something that I think got better as I stabilized the system, as I looked at ways to slow down so that I could go faster long term, because I'd been operating in a bit of a Facebook build fast and break things mentality, which is perhaps useful in the very early stages of a business when you don't have many customers and they don't really notice if there's a problem.
Yeah.
But when I had 500 customers with Smooth Messenger, that wasn't really the time to be breaking things at a whim. I needed to be a lot more careful about, especially not breaking things during North American business hours when people
Mm.
were really going to notice.
Yeah.
And just slowing down, really stopping feature development, fixing up some of the technical debt, improving the operational inefficiencies, that really helped to make it so that I wouldn't have to wake up at that time.
And from that perspective, what you're talking about there, you mentioned about you're getting tired and you weren't as effective. And I liken that to the story of the two woodcutters, where one is always sitting down all the time, but at the end of the day, that person cuts much more wood. And so, how is that possible? And they said, well, every time I sat down, I was sharpening my axe.
Hmm.
Um, is that what you've found from your perspective as a business owner now, that you actually, that rest time actually gives you the ability to be more productive in those times that you are actually working?
Absolutely. I would attribute it to time that I can spend in strategic thinking, because
Hmm.
when I'm constantly doing, I'm focused on the task in front of me, and I'm not really thinking about how can I make this task obsolete? How can I delegate it? How can I automate it? How can I not do it at all? And what would happen if I didn't do that?
Yeah.
So I've really found that time, it's not necessarily meditation, but time when I go for a walk or a run, or just go and cook dinner without listening to a podcast or anything like that at the same time, even though you should listen to this podcast, just do it in a mindful way. I found that the more time I have like that, the more effective I become. And that's really counterintuitive. It, the way that I normally think is that more hours equals more things done. But at a certain point, when I've got a team, I need to look for leverage. I need to look for ways that my time can actually unlock other people's ability. I
Mm.
think I'm a bit better at that now.
I love what you said there about, and I'm not offended by telling people not to listen to the podcast. You got to have time, and the reason I'm going to say that is because I think it's really, really important. Um, for example, with my son, when we get in the car and I take him to school, there's certain music he likes, but it's all inspirational type music. It's soundtracks, upbeat soundtracks from things like Wonder Woman and King Arthur. Those, and we listen to that, and that's his choice. He wants to listen to that, and there's no dialogue in there. It's just or no lyrics. It is just music. And same as well, I hear where I am record these. It's down in the beach house, and I've got a large lawn, and I got rid of the gardener, and I actually bought myself a self-propelled lawnmower, not one that you sit on, but you had to walk behind it, but you don't have to push it because it's a bit of a hill. And I'll go out there and I will, not deliberately not take any music or anything with me and just go up and down. I call it gumping. I'm Forrest Gump, going up and down on my lawnmower, behind my lawnmower. And I found that even when if I'm really stressed and I go do that, then afterwards I actually have all these inspirations.
Hmm.
Did you experience that same sort of thing when you went from going flat out to then having this balanced life? And mind you, kudos as well. Cooking dinner for your wife with nothing on, no music on, or podcasts on or anything like that. But the fact that you're cooking dinner for your wife, that's got to get you so many credits. I mean, just a smart move. For guys listening, just a little tip. The man.
It's not always the tastiest food, but she does appreciate it after a busy day.
Well,
Yeah, I 100% find that I have to take a piece of paper and a pen with me when I'm out on my walks, or when I'm in the kitchen. I'll keep something that I can take notes on handy, because it really does seem to result in that busy hands, quiet mind approach, that I'll have thoughts come in that otherwise wouldn't have come in. And often, for example, I had a situation where Focus Bear was about to be featured on Channel 10 News, and I was very stressed about it because there was a problem with the app. And I was, in the morning, I'd been frantically coding away trying to fix it. And then I took a break and had the realization, hang on, I don't actually need to fix it. I just will change it from a download link to a waiting list form. And that
uh,
saved me hours of effort. And I think it's a good example of how I can often be doing things the hard way when there's actually an easy way just around the corner.
Hmm. I wonder about that because I see that a lot in the work that I do, because people talk a lot about working smarter, not harder. Yet, from what I've seen, people do the opposite because they feel. Well, why do you think that is? Why do you think people actually they consciously know work smarter, but they'll push ahead and work harder? What do you think that driver is?
mean, we could say the puritanical work ethic, but I don't know that there's that much puritanism in Australia. I think it may partly
Where's
be
the
due
esky?
to, yeah. I think for me, I can't really speak for the broader population, but for me, there's something about the way that modern work is often set up with, where
Okay.
not many people, including me, I don't have my phone on silent mode a lot of the time. My brain is constantly being interrupted by Slack messages. I don't have email notifications, but I did have a lot of dings going off, and that tends to stultify the brain a little bit, that it makes it feel like I'm constantly busy, even if I'm not really being that effective. And it takes a lot of courage to disconnect so that we can have more of that thinking time and actually either be immersed in deep work or be immersed in strategic thinking.
Okay. And taking back to the first business that you set up, Smooth Messenger, what was the driver to do that? What did you want to? Why start a business? You have a secure job. What's the reason for starting a business?
At the time, it actually, even though I technically started it in 2020, I had actually really started that business in 2011. I just graduated from university and I didn't have a stable job at that point.
Yeah.
I was freelancing at the time, doing consulting work for Zoho CRM. I continued doing that for the next 5 years or so, where I was helping small business owners set up their customer relationship management system, doing customization for them. And what I found was that many of those business owners were asking me to do the same custom work, that they wanted a way to configure the distribution of leads to their salespeople. And I had written some code for that and written a blog post. And I started seeing that that was the most popular blog post on my site, that a lot of people had that problem. And around that time, Zoho allowed developers for the first time to be able to sell plugins on their marketplace. I built a plugin for an advanced round robin that was just a way of making sure that when a lead came in, perhaps by filling out a lead capture form on the website, that it would be evenly distributed amongst the salespeople. And that did okay. I started getting some recurring revenue from that. And I really liked that because I found consulting sometimes really good and sometimes very stressful. And it
Depends on the client, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I really wanted a way to be able to scale up. I had scaled up previously by hiring other people to help me, and that hadn't actually gone very well. I had overextended myself and taken on too many projects, and I had been disappointed by my team, probably my fault for not training them well enough. So I was very eager this time around with the next iteration of the business to have code doing more of the heavy lifting and less on humans. That experience with the advanced round robin was really encouraging for me, even though the revenue wasn't a huge amount. Just seeing it come in without much effort from me and seeing that if I made one tweak, that it helped hundreds of people rather than just one person at a time.
It's an addictive thing, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Subscription revenue is very addictive.
Yeah.
And then Smooth Messenger was an extension of that I saw people also asking for an ability to send SMS out of their CRM. And there weren't really any good integrations available on the marketplace. So I had a go at building that, and that ended up growing much more quickly than the round robin plugin did. And it started generating pretty decent revenue almost from month 3 or 4. And then I was able to hire a team, especially hiring someone in El Salvador so that I didn't have to wake up as early and deal with those North American clients.
That's very clever. That's working smarter.
Well, I had to do it. I was feeling like I was going to be very sleep deprived if I didn't.
Fair enough too. And it sounds like what the reason for starting the business, the initial one, was that you identified a problem that needed to be solved, and then you found an innovative way to solve a problem. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, and I think that's really key, especially with software businesses, that there can be a tendency if you're someone who's technical, and
Mhm.
maybe it also applies to if you're an inventor or if you're on the tools in general, that it's very tempting to focus on building things.
Mm.
But all the research suggests that you're much better off talking to customers first and really understanding the problems that they face and then building something around that. And I'd done it the wrong way for about 5 previous products. I'd come up with ideas and put it out there to crickets, basically, that I'd build these apps and no one really wanted to use them.
Mm.
But because Advanced Round Robin and Smooth Messenger were based on clear customer demand and people were actually already paying me to do it on a consulting basis, I knew that there was demand for it, and it made it a lot safer to build it.
How did you separate that out? Having that initial, because you didn't build something before just because for the sake of it, you obviously felt that it had a need. But then how did you separate out that you actually identify the need first and then build to that need of the client? It sounds like a fine distinction.
Yeah, there's a slogan from Steve Blank, who's one of the founders of Y Combinator, a startup accelerator, and he says, as a business owner, you have to get out of the building, go and talk to people. And there's a bit of a rule of thumb that you should do, say, 20 customer interviews where you're actually on the phone talking to people, understanding their problems before you go out and solve them. Because I
Mm.
might talk to one person and they might say that it's a big problem that their lawnmower doesn't go up hills. But then if I go and talk to 19 other people, maybe their backyard is flat and they don't really care.
Yeah.
So it's important to get. It's not necessarily doing a survey, it's not quantitative data, but it's talking to enough people to understand the problem is really important, and something that I personally was averse to doing. It was basically only because I had failed many times that I was finally willing to do it.
That step that you're talking about, and I'm laughing along with you because I relate to that so much. I was very much a technical person when I was younger, to the point where even in discussing things with people, I would be trying to explain the technical aspects of, why these are the facts, these are the situations. And it was very late. I'm older than I look. It was later in life that someone told me, they said, it's not what you say that people remember, it's how you make them feel. And when that light bulb went off for me, it was, oh, so now my conversations are very, very different in how I facilitate them. Sometimes I don't care about making people feel nice because I don't like them. But other than that, most people generally don't fit that category. So I'm always looking for, how do I make people feel good? But when you look at it from your software development expertise, because you've got that's your background, you've got, the experience that you've got, where you've got a bachelor of environmental sciences and all this technical experience that you have. What was, when you're starting the business, what were the extra skills that you needed to learn? What were the key ones that stood out and you went, hang on a minute, I need to learn something different here. It's not just about the product or the service. There's a bit more to running business. There's other skill sets here. What were some of those key skill sets that you had to learn?
Hiring and managing a team would
Hmm.
be two of the main ones.
Hmm.
I made a lot of early mistakes with hiring.
Hmm.
I built up my team mainly via Upwork, which is a freelancing marketplace,
Yeah.
and found that I initially was optimizing for people who were very cheap,
Hmm.
and that ended up not necessarily
Talking
going that
about
well.
peanuts and monkeys, is that?
Yeah, and it's not necessarily that there's anything wrong with them. I have found subsequently people who are not expensive but have the right attitude. I think that's really key. and it's hard to assess that from a resume or from someone's profile. I've found now that it's really important that I do a trial job before I actually commit to someone. So what I do now is I'll look at their Upwork profile and I'll look at what other clients have said about them and what their star rating is. And that's generally a pretty good signal, but they might not work with me well. So now what I do is I give them a small piece of work that'll take them about 10 hours. I pay them for it and I see what it's like. That after 10 hours, they might amaze me or it might feel a little bit iffy. And if that happens, rather than in the past, if it didn't go that well initially, I'd just think, oh, well, I'm sure it will get better. Now I don't. I'll just say thank you very much and I'll pay them and I'll end the contract. Because what I really like that approach of if it's not a hell yeah, then it's a hell no. That I really need to work with people who are going to deal with my idiosyncrasies and my quirks, that I tend to not be great at being super specific with the tasks that I give people. And I really need people who are going to ask me a lot of questions and try and interpret the ambiguity. I found that with my team now, but many of the earlier people that I hired needed a lot more direction than I was capable of giving.
That's an interesting point that because you've really had a look at what are your traits and your skill set, and you do reference that in some of your background. But you've applied that to the hiring side of things as well, where you're looking at it going, okay, what is the personality type that can actually interpret or fill in the blanks, if I'm hearing you correctly? Is that what you've taken and done?
Yeah, absolutely. So I find that the people I have right now on both the Smooth Messenger and the Focus Bear team are amazing at that they have sufficient context about the business problem that they're going to ask intelligent questions. So I find that if I hire people who don't really have any domain expertise in the business side of it, that they're going to, maybe they can write amazing code, but they're going to make bad assumptions because they don't really understand what customers need. Whereas, say, with Focus Bear, the lead developer there, his daughter is neurodivergent, so he really understands the type of customers that we have. And he's able to, if I give him something which is a bit vague, he'll ask me 5 different questions and he'll say, hang on, Jeremy, I don't think we should be doing it that way. I think this way might be better. Yeah. And that's really helpful to have someone who pushes back and who gives fresh ideas. Really value that.
I love that. And how do you go about explaining things in a way that you can get things across? Obviously, you've got some people to ask questions, which is great. Because I found, from my experience, I would put things out there and I'd send people out and then they'd come back and they'd do something completely different to what I'd asked. And I'm like, and so from my process has become more shorter clarifications. And when I said shorter periods of clarification, it's not so much here's a project, go ahead and do it. It's we have little steps along the way. We go, okay, here's what I think you should do, and I get them to relay that back. And if it sounds like they understand, okay, we'll catch up tomorrow and go through it. And then I can catch very quickly whether they've got the understanding or not. That's a methodology, one of the ones that I use. What ways do you use to make sure that the projects are moving ahead in the way that you anticipate them to move ahead?
Very similar to what you described. But if I'm asking someone to write code rather than them actually writing the code first, we'll have a conversation and then I'll get them to do a prototype where they might design it as a diagram showing how the data is going to move from one system to another system. And that really helps to crystallize the understanding, because it means rather than me having to necessarily do it in great detail myself, I give them the overall parameters and they come up with a way of doing it that might be better than what I thought. And I can inspect what they've done and we can have another chat about it. And if it seems like it's on the right track, they'll continue. Otherwise, we'll have a conversation and I'll re-clarify the objectives.
So is it really coming back to that going backwards and forwards? And it seems to me that the people that I've spoken to in positions like yourself have that same thing where they regularly touching base with the people that they're working with.
Hmm. Yeah, and I've had to get better at that because the autistic side of me is quite averse to having especially voice calls. I tended in the past to do everything via chat,
Mm-hmm.
and especially because many of the people that I hired are overseas, sometimes that can work better in that their spoken English is often not as good as their written English.
Mm-hmm.
But I found that it really needs to be more detailed, that I can't just write it. I need to, if it's something where I'm asking them to change a web page, I need to have a screenshot and I need to draw arrows on it pointing to exactly what I want them to change. But now it's sort of a combination of that the initial task that I'll put together will have the screenshot with the arrows on it, but then we'll talk it through as well so I can give additional context.
Yeah, I love that. I've done that in some web design where I've had that same thing. I had the screenshot. I've actually drawn exactly what I wanted and then used PinkWrite and go, this does that, and go through that process. When you were setting up the business initially and the second one as well, what kind of goals did you set that you wanted to achieve? What was some objectives? Were you clear about the objectives? Did you have revenue goals? Did you have size of business, customer reach? Did you have goals along those lines?
Not really. I don't tend to do long range business planning. I tend to follow more of the seat of my pants approach of what am I going to achieve in the next week.
Yeah.
And to some extent, that sometimes works in that there can be a bit of analysis paralysis, that if I spend forever thinking about what am I going to build, then I might see, according to this Gartner report, the market size is $76 billion for productivity software. I should go down that route. But it doesn't actually mean that I can build it, and it doesn't mean that I can sell it. So I like the lean startup approach of really doing bottom-up business planning, where I have some assumptions that I want to test. For example, with Focus Bear, one of the assumptions is that people will actually pay for a mobile app, and I'm yet to validate that because I haven't yet monetized the mobile app. But there's another assumption around the desktop app, and I have validated that people are paying for the desktop app. So I like the approach with what Eric Ries talks about in the Lean Startup of figuring out what are the assumptions that could sink the business if they're wrong. That my assumption with Smooth Messenger was that people did want to send SMS. And if they didn't, then it would sink the business. But after trying it out with a few people, that assumption was validated. And then there are always more assumptions to validate, but the key message out of that book is to try and validate them in the cheapest way possible. That rather than me going out and spending 100 hours building something, maybe I can do just a screenshot with pink writing and say, if it was like this, would it be helpful? And that might be enough to get the feedback that I need.
Love that. And when you were setting up the business, I mean, going through that process with both businesses, we have this plan that things are going to go a certain way. And it really does. It's kind of like war. As soon as the first shot is fired, the plan's out the window and you adapt to what you're dealing with. When we're looking at your process of working through that, there's an element of resilience and things like that we need to keep moving forward because we're going to have setbacks. What do you think are some of the traits that you have that helped you continue on to keep moving forward, to stay, on the path?
There's an aspect of self-delusion that may be required, especially in the early stages. There's that choice of persevere or pivot or perish. That if I've got an idea for a business, I need to try a few things and get some feedback from people initially to see if it's anywhere near on the right track. And if the feedback is that people don't really care about it or they wouldn't pay for it, then the right choice may actually be to stop working on it. But the other thing is that maybe the feedback that you get is that it's good, but it's a good idea, but the execution is bad. And I think that's what I faced with Smooth Messenger in the early days, that the very early version of the app, it got customers almost immediately, but the feedback was that it was very buggy and it was unreliable. And I had almost immediately, say, a 3-star rating in the App Store. And that could be completely demoralizing and make me think, oh, I'm never going to be able to fix this up. Or it can be fodder for a belief that it can get better. And that's how I tried to take it, that even though the feedback was negative, there was still hope there. And I kept on persevering and kept on polishing the product and got to 4 stars and then 4.5 stars. And now eventually it's at 5 stars. And the same thing with Focus Bear, that it took a lot of revision and a lot of iteration to get it to the point where it was actually attractive to customers.
How does that make you feel? How do you have that drive to go, okay, this hasn't worked out the way I wanted it to. I need to continue moving forward. And I liken this to my son and I. We play video games from time to time. Me, not so much anymore, but he certainly does. But we went to my friend's house one night. We're having a poker night, and he had a remake of one of the old Atari 2600 video games that I played when I was a kid. And my son was playing it, and after his 3 lives were up, he had to go back to the beginning. And he's like, "What? You can't respawn?" And I'm just wondering what it is that it takes to actually go, okay, I've got 3 stars, and not throw in the towel and go, okay, I can actually make this work. What was it that gave you that hope that you could make it work?
It is really an emotional game there of looking at how am I feeling about it, that I'm feeling really anxious that it's ever going to work, and dealing with those emotions in a constructive way. I use mindfulness and I do journaling at the end of the day, and that really helps me to be able to process those feelings and to be able to bounce back even when things are not going the way that I want them to. But there are times too where that feedback may indicate that it is time to stop. There were times, for example, in my early consulting days where we had a lot of clients, but it was losing money because I had issues with quality and the team weren't delivering on time and clients weren't paying. And I, rather than keep going, which I basically couldn't because I was at my credit limit. I was paying my team with credit cards, and I just couldn't keep going at that point. And there was clear feedback that something needed to radically change. So I stopped hiring people at that point and changed the business, pivoted towards getting a day job and still doing the consulting, but just me doing it on my own for a while until I had built up the cash reserves again and learned some skills around how to hire and which projects to take on. So I think that is important, that sometimes it's okay to stop. And that information from the market or from your credit card company is important to respect.
What was that like? How did you go through that process? Because what I want to understand is the learning that you now have around the capital needed to start a business. And I know from my experience, I spent many years working in corporate recovery, so dealing with distressed businesses. I would say pretty much somewhere between 80 and 90% of those were in that situation because they didn't have enough capital. That was a major, not the only factor, but a major contributing factor. And I know from my own experiences, a couple of businesses I've started and we're not getting the revenue growth. And I've just gone, no, and pulled the pin. And where do you now see it as far as that capital that's needed, not just money capital, but time capital as well? How has your focus shifted between version 1 and version 2 of the businesses you've started?
Yeah, there's a few aspects to it that I'm glad you mentioned the time capital as well, because it can be challenging to actually put in enough time to get it off the ground, that in the early stages it might not actually necessarily be capital intensive, but it's definitely time intensive in terms of talking to customers and figuring out what they're going to need.
Mm-hmm.
And in terms of the financial side of it, I think for me, one of the key things is to constrain my enthusiasm and to avoid growing too fast. There's the philosophy of profit first, which I quite like, where basically, rather than the Silicon Valley approach of trying to blitz scale and grow really big, really quickly, the author of that book encourages business owners to grow without compromising on the profitability of the business. And I don't know that I've necessarily strictly followed that advice. I have with Smooth Messenger, I followed it for the early stages, that I was very careful not to hire too fast and to make sure that it was generating enough profit, and that I was able to have a safety net going forward. But there was a time when the acquirer reached out to me, when I decided to actually invest some of my personal capital into it, and the business was technically losing money, but I was feeling optimistic that after the acquisition, the extra push that I gave it at that point would make it easier for me to hit further targets from that point. But that's a very dangerous way of thinking as well. I think it's important to live within our means, both personally and from a business perspective, and to try and grow it in the cheapest way possible. That I can find ways to, going back to the lean startup approach, I can find ways to, if I want to run a retail store, I can find ways to test that by going to a market and selling a few things at the market, rather than needing to pay for a lease and having a lot of staff. And there are often many ways where we can validate demand for the product or service without needing to incur a lot of ongoing costs.
So that testing phase is what you're talking about there as well, to help in that process. But when you had that expectation of, okay, I'm going to start this business, I'm going to get a certain amount of revenue, and then there's a certain amount of cost associated with that. Was there an awakening there where it was, okay, there's a little bit more effort to get the revenue that I thought I was going to get, because there's an element of optimism bias, and there's extra expenses that I didn't anticipate. Again, optimism bias kicking in. Did you have that experience?
Yeah, well, I've definitely had that with Focus Bear, where I've put a lot of money into it and the revenue growth has been slow. But I guess I had the luxury there of having proceeds from the sale of the last business, that I was able to have a longer runway. Whereas with Smooth Messenger, I didn't really have much of a runway. And so I had to be very careful about matching expenses with revenue. And it's probably generally a good principle to follow. And I'm now having to follow it a lot more carefully.
I'm laughing with you because I'm relating to that, because that was exactly one of my businesses, had heaps of cash. And so I threw some into this business going, yeah, it'll be right. And then nearly 10 months later, a lot of money was lost, and it was like, no, and ended up shutting it down because of just, I'm not putting more money into this. That testing phase, is there any tips or strategies that you've learnt to, that you could pass on as to how to test that there is a market there for what you want?
Yeah, so the customer interviews is part of it. I think the other side is that in order to be able to validate demand, it may take a long time of building up trust. Because if I'm a stranger and I go up to you and say, hey, do you want to do a pre-order for a mobile app that I'm building, and the person doesn't know me at all, there's no way they're going to do that. But with Smooth Messenger, I actually did do that after I had built the CRM extension, I had a lot of people saying, we want a mobile app, and I didn't have the cash to build that myself. So what I did was I said, okay, you want to have a mobile app? That's fine. What I'll need is a $500 prepayment, which will be a lifetime license for the mobile app. And I ended up getting 20 grand out of pre-orders from that. And I was then able to actually hire mobile app devs to build it. I think that's a really good test that if people are willing to make a pre-order, that's a very strong sign that there's a demand for it, that even in the absence of them getting the product immediately, they're willing to pay. It's very encouraging. And for people who don't know you, the amount has to be less, that they're probably not going to give you $500, but maybe a bit like with Teslas, that if you want to get a Tesla, you have to make a pre-order.
Yeah, so having that, again, creating that, that's linking into the sales part of running a business. How did you create that credibility? Obviously, with the pre-orders for the mobile app you just talked about, they trusted that you could do what you could do because you provided that previous software. Is there any other elements that you've learned through the sales process of how to attract sales? Because again, coming back to what we talked about at the start, I mean, I think life is pretty simple. There's some simple principles. If we follow them, it just falls into place. Again, if you want to be wealthy, keep something of what you earn, invest that money and reinvest the income from that. It's not a question. You'll be wealthy. That's just the numbers. Business, I find, is similar. And business is, you mentioned about solving a problem, and that there is a problem that people want solved. And then marketing is, telling people about what you've got or how you're solving the problem is marketing. Building the trust that they'll buy it from you is sales. In that process of sales, how is there anything that you've learned, from version 1 to version 2? I love this version 1 to version 2. It's kind of cool. I don't often get to talk about this. Is great. That you've learned as to how to make sales work more smoothly?
I've never done outbound sales successfully in terms of cold calling people. I've always mainly operated from a content funnel, where I had, with my first business, I had a blog, which in the scheme of things was not hugely read. Like I probably had maybe 3,000 visitors per month. And the same thing for my YouTube channel that I had now at its peak, I have 1,800 subscribers, which sounds like nothing, but that's actually huge in my industry of Zoho consulting. I'm basically a thought leader in the Zoho space. And because I have been putting out so much content, and it's not salesy content, it's how-to videos on how to write the lead script so that you can update a record in Zoho CRM, for example. And I have just done that consistently for 5+ years. Of every time I learned something, I would, mainly for my own benefit, I would record it in a blog post so that if I forgot how to do it, I could go back and read it again.
I love that.
The same thing with the videos, that it was easy for me to author that content. And that ended up establishing trust and authority because people could see that I knew what I was doing based on those videos and blog posts. And they were then willing to try out my product.
Cool. I love that you brought up those numbers, because again, it really comes down to your market as well. People can feel that they're not getting anywhere because their social might not have a lot of followers. But I know, and you will know from being in Australia, for the people overseas, some of you might know, but there's a very famous businessman here who sells tiles. His name is Frank Walker from National Tiles, and he has radio ads which are really well known. And I was talking with Frank, and he was telling me, we were talking about advertising and marketing, and there's a number of his ads which have gone viral. People have taken them. DJs at raves have taken it, and they've got Frank Walker at National Tiles, and they and it's gone viral on over social media. And then he said to me, how many extra sales do you think I got out of that? And he said 0. I got it impacted the business nothing whatsoever. But he goes, I change a few words in my radio ad and I'll bank $1 million that weekend. We know it. We've actually, and he showed me his calendar. He has this calendar set up where he changes the words in the ads, and they know that they're $1 million weekends. And so I really love that you brought up, because it's not so much the number of people following you, but it's the right people that are following you that make the difference.
Yeah.
And from that as well, When you were talking about that process of uh, being that outbound, that sales funnel, creating that trust, was it a case of, you've put out there what I call the strategic, probably the best strategic plan that you can have. You've got a YouTube channel marketed at, if I'm hearing you correctly, marketed at people that need your service, but you've become the most sought after for information in that space. So people are in the area that you're marketing to, so they come to you and they trust you because you're sought after. Was that a strategic, specific plan that you had, or was it more, as you said, just to record it so you didn't forget it later on?
A combination of the two. I had read a book about content marketing, and
Hmm.
that really inspired me about the prospect of both being useful and getting people to buy from you as a result. And it was something that I initially did an experiment with. I probably did the first 20 videos without expecting much of a result. And I saw a result. I saw people saying, "Hey, I saw your YouTube video. It seems like you know what you're doing. Can you do some work for me?"
Yeah.
And that really validated it, that it was worth continuing doing more of that.
Mm.
And, and now I just enjoy creating content. So I don't mind doing it.
There is an element when you actually enjoy what you're doing as well.
Hmm.
What were some of the surprise setbacks that you had in starting up the businesses?
Two I'll mention. One is the structure of the business. When I initially set up my holding company for the consulting business, I had the IP for Smooth Messenger in there as well.
Hmm.
And that ended up being a complication during the sale process,
Yeah.
that it was a little bit tricky to actually extract or to sell only that piece of IP and not the rest of the business.
Yeah.
So that's one thing I've learned, that I don't necessarily advocate doing it immediately before there's any market demand, but once it's clear that a software product or a specific part of the business is going to be a revenue generating part of it, I think it's probably worth separating it out. And that is also helpful in terms of accounting, that it's much easier for me to see how much I'm spending on a particular cost center if it's got its own proprietary limited entity and its own set of books.
Mm. Was that difficult to do, to separate it out? I mean, setting up a company is pretty straightforward. That's not too difficult. An accountant can do it if you don't know how to do it yourself. Um, but was it difficult to separate out what is the intellectual property?
It it was a little bit. I had to get some expensive taxation advice at the point of selling it. But basically, what happened in the end was the acquirer bought the company, and before the sale, I was allowed to transfer out the services and products and intellectual property that were unrelated to what they were buying. So it worked out fine in the end.
Yeah.
But it would have been less stressful had I done it in a separate manner initially.
Yeah. So if your plan is to eventually sell the software, you'd want to have that now in a separate entity, so to speak. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah. Yeah. So I've done that with Focus Bear, for example, that it's got its own company.
So it's own little Focus Bear Pty Ltd.
Exactly.
I love that. What do you think are the critical turning points you went through in your entrepreneurial journey?
I really like the stair-stepping philosophy from Rob Walling, where he
Mhm.
talks about how to actually go from being a full-time employee to being a full-time business owner. And there are two ways of thinking about it. One is that you basically save up a lot of money and then you quit your job and you go full-time on the business.
Mhm.
And he argues that that's a very risky approach. The
Mm.
approach that he recommends is to stair step, where you do that initial customer validation and make sure that there is actually demand for the product or the service. And
Mhm.
then you start doing it part time or on the weekends, and you start getting some revenue. And then you go down to 4 days a week in your day job. And as you get more revenue, you progressively decrease the number of days in the day job and increase the number of days in the business. I really like that approach. It's the way that I did it with Smooth Messenger, that I was progressively decreasing my hours. I was down to 2 days a week at the time of the acquisition. And now that's what I'm doing with FocusFair as well.
And when you're, if you were to do it again and you look back at that, what would be some of the key pieces of advice you'd give to yourself if you weren't able to go back in time, jump in that DeLorean time machine from Back to the Future and hit 88 miles an hour? And what would you tell yourself? What are some of the, the advice that you would give yourself if you were to do it again?
Pretty much what we've already spoken about. Get out of the building, talk to people, even though it's uncomfortable. And also, I guess the other thing that I've learned with FocusFair is I tried to outsource the marketing, and that didn't really work. I spent quite a lot of money on a marketing consulting agency, and they had a good go at it. I basically was hiring them to do customer interviews. And they did it. They interviewed 100 people, and I read what was written, but it didn't really resonate, and it didn't allow me to actually shape the marketing myself. And the marketing didn't resonate. It wasn't my own voice until I took control of it myself, and I started talking to people on my own. I'd probably done about 20 interviews on my own initially, but I found that doing more of the interviews myself, doing some of the sales and the customer support myself was really important, even though it's not scalable. But I think it's very important in the early days to get up close and personal with customers to really understand their needs. And if I shield myself too much from that, it's going to be dangerous. That's one of the main things that I've learned.
Is that because when we talk about listening, I mean, it's one thing to listen with your ears and hear the words, so to speak. But when you're actually interacting with someone, as we know, majority of communication is not the words. It's not verbal. It's so many other factors. Is that part of that, what you would attribute to that difference? Because it's one thing for someone to go and ask some questions, give you a report and say, this is what they've said. But it's another if you're actually there asking the questions, but you can also ask further information as well. Is that part of that difference?
Yeah, definitely reading between the lines. And also, I think one of the challenges with the type of software that I'm selling, where it's aimed at people with ADHD and autism, it's not really something that a neurotypical person can sell. That there's probably a reluctance for someone who is neurodivergent to talk in detail with someone who isn't. Whereas when I talk to people, I share my own lived experience and they open up. And I think that contributes towards trust as well, when they can see that the software was built by people who also are autistic and have ADHD. That really helps resonate. And that's probably applicable in other sectors as well, that if you're selling lawnmowers, but you don't actually have a lawn yourself, I think that's pretty hard to be coherent, that you really have to live and breathe the product in order to be able to sell it effectively.
Yeah, and there's so many stories of focus groups getting it wrong. I mean, Seinfeld was rejected by many focus groups and yet become one of the most popular TV shows. Just as one example. What about, when you're talking about those connections as well, getting out there, how much has that actually helped you create business relationships or open up doors to opportunities that might not have been there?
It has really helped. As a concrete example, on Reddit, there's a subreddit called ADHD Programmers, and I've spent a lot of time in there hanging out, answering general questions. And as part of that, I've actually found people to work in my team. And that's been helpful because they really get the problem, because they were using it themselves and they empathize with the target market. And I think in general, having people on the team who really understand the customer problem massively helps, that everyone's speaking the same language and everyone is able to think about what the customer would want, because they're basically the customer themselves.
I love that. That's awesome. And then it's one of those things that I always find amazing, is that it is really about getting out there and interacting with people. Makes a big difference. Which is kind of why I think the VR stuff is sort of never really took off, because it's kind of, you're putting goggles over your eyes and you're shielding yourself from other people. That's just my little gripe, but I'm going to leave that there. Tell us a bit about Focus Bear, your current business. What is it for? Who's it aimed at? This is your product placement part of the podcast. Tell us about it and sell your wares, so to speak.
Sure. So it's a combination of a work-life balance app and a productivity app. And at the time that I was building it, I hadn't actually been diagnosed with ADHD. It came as a bit of a surprise to me that, as part of that market research that I was telling you about, one of the findings that the agency had was, the biggest target market seems to be people with ADHD. They seem to be the ones who have the problem that is most similar to what you've built the app around. And I ended up going and talking to a psychologist and getting diagnosed with off the charts ADHD. So that was a bit of a personal journey as well. I had been pre-diagnosed with autism, so that was less of a surprise, but I got that confirmed as well. And so going back to what the product does, the goal of it is to help manage distractions. So that the reason why it was most applicable for people with ADHD is that distractions tend to be a really large problem for people with ADHD. I can easily be working on a report and then I'll have a thought that maybe I should go and check what's happening in Ukraine right now, because I wonder how the war's going, and that can send me down a rabbit hole that will completely derail my productivity. And I wanted something that would actually be a bit like Ulysses in the Odyssey, where his sailors tied him to the mast so that he wouldn't get tempted by the sirens.
Yes.
That's basically what the app does, that if I go to a news site, it pops up saying, you said you didn't want to go to this type of site during work hours. Click here to save it for after work, or click here if you just don't actually need it. And it blocks it for me so that I don't get distracted when I'm meant to be focusing.
I love that. That's awesome.
Yeah, and then the others. Oh, you go.
I was going to say, how do people find out about the app? How do they get hold of it?
At focusbear.io or Google Focus Bear.
I love that. We'll put that in the show notes as well. Pretty cool. Before we finish and go, can you, in a nutshell, choice of wisdom, what is it that you'd want business owners to take away, or potential business owners as well, to take away from this interview? What would you want to leave them with?
The biggest message I'd like to leave people with is the importance of consistency, that there are things that are important to do that take a long time and that sometimes are a little bit boring. For example, content creation or doing your books. And it becomes a real problem if you leave it for weeks or months and don't look at it. But it's actually very easy if you do a little bit each day. And that's something that I'd recommend, that if we can find ways to systematize some of the tasks that you can't delegate and you can't automate, if you can spend a little bit of time every day, then it makes those kind of things avoid turning into a massive problem. For example, rather than the tax return being a real debacle and feeling super stressed about it, if we've been doing preparation throughout the year, then it's very easy.
I love that. The consistency is such a powerful factor in successfully running a business. Again, as we've talked about, and I talk about a lot, is, life is simple, business is simple. If we do those consistent actions, as Jeremy's talking about, make your life much, much easier. Jeremy, it has been such a pleasure having you on the Growing Revenue and Profit podcast. Such wonderful wisdom that you've shared for people that are wanting to start up a business, steps to take. Thank you very much for taking the time.
It's been a pleasure. Thanks for having me on.